The snow began to fall in earnest just after 11 o'clock, transforming the moorland landscape into a vast white wilderness that seemed to swallow both sound and civilization. The Midnight Guesthouse stood like a solitary beacon against the storm, its warm windows casting golden rectangles of light across the rapidly accumulating drifts. What had begun as a gentle evening snowfall had evolved into something far more ominous, the kind of blizzard that could cut off the remote establishment from the outside world for days. Inside the guest house, the atmosphere was one of cozy refinement tinged with the peculiar intimacy that develops when strangers find themselves unexpectedly thrown together. The main lounge, with its crackling wood fire and comfortable, if somewhat worn furnishings, housed an eclectic assembly of guests who had each, for their own reasons, chosen to spend the New Year period in this isolated corner of Dartmoor. The gathering takes shape. Miss Celia Hargrove sat with characteristic poise at the card table, her ash-blonde hair drawn back in a precise knot, and her clear grey eyes focused intently on her bridge hand. There was something almost austere about her careful dress and guarded expression, as though she had learned to reveal nothing of herself that was not absolutely necessary. Across from her, Colonel Arthur Redmayne, whose military bearing remained undiminished by retirement, played his cards with the same decisive authority he had once brought to commanding troops. "That clock," observed Miss Hargrove, glancing toward the grandfather clock that had just chimed midnight with its characteristic unpunctuality, "is in a perpetual state of repentance. It sins all day and then rushes madly to catch up before bed." Near the writing desk by the window, Mr. Lionel Drake paused in his correspondence, his nervous hands trembling slightly as he set down his pen. He was a thin, dark man in his early 40s, whose restless energy seemed barely contained by the evening's forced tranquility. Something in his manner suggested a man listening for sounds that had not yet come, waiting for events that might arrive at any moment. The most striking figure in the room was undoubtedly Miss Francesca Vale, Frankie to all who knew her, whose Bond Street dress and confident bearing marked her as a woman accustomed to moving in fashionable circles. Her auburn hair gleamed in the firelight, and there was an air of barely suppressed excitement about her, as though she found the isolation more thrilling than troubling. Opposite her lounged Nigel Arkwright, whose handsome features were marred by a perpetual expression of discontent. His blue eyes rested frequently on Miss Vale, though whether with admiration or something more calculating was difficult to determine. The arrival of an unexpected guest. The peaceful scene was interrupted by the urgent jangling of the front doorbell, a sound that seemed almost violent against the muffled quiet of the snowy night. Mr. Drake started so violently that his pen blotted the paper, while the other guests exchanged glances of surprise and concern. "Front door," observed Dr. Miles Cartwright, a broad-shouldered man with the neat hands of his profession, removing his pipe from his mouth. "At this hour, who on earth would be abroad in such weather?" Mrs. Bligh, the proprietress, appeared in the doorway with her characteristic air of domestic authority slightly ruffled by the unexpected arrival. "There's a gentleman at the door," she announced, "foreign by his accent and very particular about his room. Says he wrote weeks ago to book it, and he has the letter to prove it." The guests stirred with the peculiar anticipation that novelty always brings to a closed circle. When Mrs. Bligh returned moments later, she was followed by a small, dapper figure who paused in the doorway with an air of apologetic courtesy. "Messieurs, mesdames," said a voice in which a faintly foreign intonation was perceptible, though the English was fluent and precise. "Permit that I intrude upon your cozy little circle." He stood removing snowflakes from his dark overcoat with meticulous care, revealing beneath his removed hat an egg-shaped skull and a luxuriant, perfectly groomed mustache. His greenish eyes, shrewd and observant, took in every detail of the room and its occupants with the swift assessment of a man trained to notice everything. "I'm desolated to arrive at so unseasonable an hour," he continued, stepping into the room with that curious precision that makes some men ridiculous and others impressive. "But the snow, it is implacable, eh? I implore that you will forgive me." The introduction of Hercule Poirot. Edward Latimer, whose job as a broadcaster had trained him to recognize notable figures, was the first to respond with dawning recognition. "Hercule Poirot," he repeated, and there was a tiny pause, a faint, almost electric suspension in the air that followed the name. For those who read newspapers attentively, particularly the more sensational items concerning crime and detection, the name of Hercule Poirot carried considerable weight. Here was the legendary Belgian detective whose methods had unraveled some of the most perplexing mysteries of recent years. Poirot inclined his head graciously. "You know of me, monsieur. I am honored." His eyes twinkled with modest pleasure as he accepted the offered chair by the fire, arranging himself with characteristic neatness. As the evening progressed and Poirot settled into the company with hot toddy and supper, his keen observation skills were already at work. He noticed the quick, fugitive glance that passed between certain guests when his name had been mentioned. Not alarm exactly, but something more subtle and therefore more interesting. He observed Mr. Drake's restless energy, Miss Hargrove's guarded composure, the way young Arkwright's fingers drummed impatiently, and Miss Vale's frank curiosity about his profession. "I trust," Poirot said to Miss Vale, who had confessed her excitement at meeting a real detective, "that you will never have occasion to desire my professional services. It is, how do they say, a bad thing for the clients of Hercule Poirot." The gathering storm. As the guests gradually retired for the evening, the great house settled into the peculiar quiet that comes with deep snow and isolation. Poirot, having arranged his belongings with mathematical precision in his room, drew aside the curtain to observe the transformed landscape. The snow had obliterated all familiar landmarks, creating a world both beautiful and somehow ominous in its uniformity. "Tiens," he murmured to himself, "it is like some of those souls below, perhaps. All appears so pure, so even, but beneath always there are the little irregularities, the little stains." Somewhere in the house, not all the guests slept easily. In one room, a man lay awake staring into the darkness, listening to the wind and knowing that the morning might bring changes he was powerless to prevent. The grandfather clock struck one with grave deliberation, marking time in a house that contained, at that moment, no crime which any human law could reach. But morning was still hours away, and with it would come revelations that would transform this peaceful gathering into something far more sinister. The stage was set, the players assembled, and Hercule Poirot, despite his protestations of retirement, found himself once again in the precise position where his unique talents would be most desperately needed. The affair at the Midnight Guesthouse was about to begin in earnest. The storm reached its height in the small hours of the morning, and by dawn the Midnight Guesthouse stood like a fortress besieged by winter. Hercule Poirot, who prided himself on his orderly habits, woke at 6:30 precisely and drew aside his curtain to survey the transformed landscape. Snow lay in pristine drifts that had swallowed the drive entirely, and the silence was profound, the kind of absolute quiet that comes only with deep snow and complete isolation. "Voilà," he murmured to his reflection as he adjusted his tie with mathematical precision. "We are cut off from the world, very convenient for some purposes." He descended the narrow staircase some minutes before 7, but the sounds from below suggested that others had risen even earlier. From the lounge came a rising murmur of voices, too many, too animated for such an hour. Disorder so early in the day was, in Poirot's experience, invariably a bad sign. The scene that greeted him in the lounge was one of barely controlled agitation. Miss Francesca Vale stood by the hearth in a hastily donned wrap, her chin held high despite her obvious distress. Nigel Arkwright confronted her, his fair hair rumpled and his hands clenched at his sides. "I tell you, Frankie, you went too far last night," he was saying, his voice tight with anger. "There are some things one doesn't joke about." Miss Vale's laugh came brittle as glass. "Don't be absurd, Nigel. No one has died of a little teasing yet." "Not teasing, baiting," he snapped. "You saw how Drake reacted when you mentioned forgery." Near the window, Lionel Drake stood with his thin frame drawn up defensively, his hands thrust deep into his dressing-gown pockets where they trembled visibly. His eyes, dark and hollow with sleeplessness, shifted nervously from speaker to speaker. Dr. Cartwright had positioned himself between the arguing parties and Mr. Drake. "Now then," he said in his professional, calming voice, "no use raking it all up again. What's done is done." Poirot coughed delicately, and the effect was immediate. Heads turned, conversations ceased, and embarrassed silence fell like a curtain. "Bon matin, mesdames et messieurs," said Poirot pleasantly. "There has been, I perceive, some early morning entertainment." Miss Vale's colour flew to her cheeks. "We're being dreadfully noisy, I'm afraid. It's only that Nigel insists on making everyone share his temper." "If you'd kept your tongue in check last night," Arkwright retorted, "there wouldn't be anything to be in a temper about." Drake gave a short, mirthless laugh. "Miss Vale has very decided opinions about everything, Monsieur Poirot, and she likes to express them publicly. If you hadn't behaved like a guilty schoolboy when I mentioned signatures," Miss Vale said sharply, "no one would have thought twice about it." A curious stillness fell. Mrs. Bligh, who had been hovering anxiously by the door, gasped audibly. Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest. "You spoke, mademoiselle, of signatures?" She tossed her head, but uneasiness lurked beneath the bravado. "It was only a joke. We were discussing crime. Your fault entirely, Monsieur Poirot. Someone mentioned handwriting, and I may have implied that Mr. Drake knew rather too much about imitating other people's signatures." Drake's voice, when it came, was high and strained. "She didn't imply it. She said it outright, in front of everyone. She as good as accused me of forgery." "We all knew Frankie was only ragging," Edward Latimer protested from his position by the mantelpiece. "No one imagined you'd take it so seriously." "You didn't see his face," said Arkwright harshly. "I saw it, and I saw him slip away early, too. Couldn't get out of the room fast enough." Drake moved abruptly to the window and wrenched back the curtain. "We're snowed in," he announced. "Completely. I tried the telephone. The line's dead." Mrs. Bligh uttered a small cry of distress, but before anyone could respond, her voice came floating down from the upper landing, high, shrill, and cracking with terror. Dr. Cartwright, come at once, please. Oh, my God, Mr. Drake's study. He's... The last word dissolved into incoherent sobbing, but it was unnecessary. The frozen silence that fell upon the house spoke volumes. Poirot was already moving, light and swift despite his rotund figure, his green eyes suddenly very bright and alert. Behind him, the others followed in a rush of dressing gowns and slippers, their morning quarrel forgotten in the face of something far more serious. They found Mrs. Bligh clutching the door frame of the small study, her face ashen. Inside, Lionel Drake lay sprawled across the Persian rug, a silver letter opener protruding from his chest. His nervous hands were finally still. The affair at the Midnight Guesthouse had begun in earnest. For several seconds, no one moved. The small study had taken on the frozen unreality of a tableau, the leather-bound volumes and heavy mahogany desk serving as backdrop to a scene that belonged more to the pages of a sensational novel than to the quiet routine of a country guest house. The only sound was the faint rattle of the window pane, disturbed by the dying storm outside. Dr. Cartwright was the first to break the spell, his professional instincts asserting themselves with practiced authority. He moved swiftly to the body, his broad hands seeking first the pulse at Drake's throat, then at the wrist. His examination was brief but thorough, and when he straightened, his face had settled into the grave certainty that comes with unwelcome knowledge. "He's quite dead," he announced quietly. "Has been for some time, I should judge." Mrs. Bligh gave a strangled sob and pressed her apron to her face, while behind her the assembled guests shifted uneasily in the doorway. But Poirot did not immediately approach the deceased. Instead, his keen green eyes swept the room with that peculiar intensity that seemed almost physical, taking in every detail with the methodical precision of a man trained to see what others missed. The scene before them was both stark and telling. Lionel Drake lay on his back upon the Persian rug, one arm flung rigidly outward, the other at his side. His thin face, already pale in life, had taken on the waxy pallor of death, and his dark eyes stared sightlessly at the ceiling. From his chest protruded an ornate silver letter-opener, its griffin's head hilt gleaming dully in the morning light, the blade buried deep in the fabric of his dressing gown. A small, dark stain had spread outward from the wound, but there was surprisingly little blood visible. Near the desk, a chair lay overturned and papers were scattered across the leather writing surface. An uncapped fountain pen rested beside an addressed but unsealed envelope, while a half-empty teacup sat cooling on the windowsill. Most significantly, Poirot noted a single, distinct footprint in the thin layer of dust near the door. Not Drake's slipper, but something else entirely. "Please," Poirot said, his voice carrying quiet but unmistakable authority. "No one is to touch anything. Dr. Cartwright, you will forgive me, but I must ask that you step away from the body. It is of the first importance that we preserve everything exactly as we found it." The doctor nodded grimly and withdrew. "You're quite right, of course. There's nothing more I can do for the poor fellow." Poirot turned to Mrs. Bligh, his manner gentle but precise. "Madame, you discovered him. Tell me, if you please, exactly what you observed when you came to this room." She dabbed at her eyes with her apron. "I knocked first, as I always do before cleaning a gentleman's room. When there was no answer, I pushed the door. It was standing just a little bit open, you see. And I looked in to see if he was still sleeping. That's when I saw him lying there with that horrible thing sticking out of him." She shuddered violently. "I've never seen anything so dreadful in all my life." "The door was ajar when you arrived?" Poirot pressed. "Yes, sir. Just a crack. I thought perhaps he'd left it open on purpose." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his gaze moving to study the faces of the assembled guests. Miss Vale had gone very pale, her earlier confidence completely evaporated as she clutched Arkwright's arm for support. Arkwright himself appeared torn between concern for her and a growing unease that deepened the lines around his mouth. Miss Hargrove stood slightly apart, her composed features betraying nothing, while Edward Latimer had instinctively produced a small notebook, his journalistic training asserting itself even in the face of tragedy. "The telephone?" Poirot inquired. "Dead," confirmed Dr. Cartwright, "and the snow has made the roads completely impassable. We're entirely cut off." "As I suspected," Poirot murmured, a faint sigh escaping him. "This simplifies matters considerably. The person who killed Mr. Drake, mes amis, is still among us. There is no other possibility." A collective intake of breath greeted this pronouncement. The implications were inescapable. Somewhere in their small, isolated group was a murderer. Poirot surveyed the crime scene once more, his methodical mind already beginning to process the evidence. The overturned chair suggested some form of struggle, yet Drake's position indicated he had fallen backward from a standing position. The weapon, a decorative piece that belonged to the guest house's collection of antique desk accessories, had been driven home with considerable force and precision. "Before we proceed further," Poirot announced, "I must insist that everyone return to the lounge and remain there together. No one is to go to their rooms alone, and nothing in this house is to be disturbed. Mrs. Bligh, perhaps you would be so kind as to lock this door and give me the key." As the group reluctantly withdrew, casting backward glances at the silent figure on the study floor, Poirot remained for one final moment. His eyes lingered on the scattered papers, the positioning of the furniture, and most particularly on that telltale footprint near the door. The morning's quarrel about forgery and signatures had taken on a sinister new significance. The affair at the Midnight Guesthouse had begun in earnest. They filed back into the lounge like mourners leaving a chapel, the cheerful domesticity of the room now grotesquely at odds with the knowledge that death lay only yards away behind a locked door. Mrs. Bligh sat rigidly on an armchair's edge, twisting her handkerchief into knots, her usually ruddy face drained of colour. The others arranged themselves in a loose semicircle around the hearth, seeking warmth and comfort, all except Miss Hargrove, who took a straight-backed chair slightly apart, her posture upright and composed. The silence was profound, broken only by the faint rattle of window panes disturbed by the dying storm. Miss Vale clutched Arkwright's arm, her earlier confidence completely evaporated, while Dr. Cartwright positioned himself near the fire, his broad shoulders tense with unspoken concern. Edward Latimer had instinctively produced his notebook, journalistic training asserting itself even in tragedy's face. Poirot waited until they were seated, then drew forward a small chair, placing it so he faced them directly. His hands clasped neatly on his knees, his alert green eyes traveled slowly from face to face with that peculiar intensity that seemed almost physical. "It is most unfortunate," he began quietly, "that such a tragedy should occur when we are all cut off from the world. Yet perhaps there is also an advantage. With no strangers coming and going, no traffic of visitors, the circle is complete. The murderer, mesdames et messieurs, must be one of those present in this room." Nigel Arkwright sprang to his feet. "You cannot seriously suggest that any of us—" Poirot lifted a hand with quiet authority. "I suggest nothing for the moment. I state only facts as logic presents them. Monsieur Drake has been killed. The snow and broken telephone prevent anyone arriving or departing. Therefore, we have a closed circle." He paused, his expression almost abstract. "Such situations are of great professional interest to me." "It's monstrous," burst out Miss Vale, her voice unsteady. "Lionel may have had his faults, but to be stabbed in that ghastly way—" "Ah, mademoiselle, you speak of faults," Poirot said gently. "This morning you mentioned a quarrel last night concerning signatures. It will be necessary that I know exactly what passed." A faint flush rose to Arkwright's cheek. "It was nothing really. Frankie was provocative as usual. She made a joke in poor taste, that's all." "It was not a joke," Miss Vale said sharply, throwing up her chin with defiant resolve. "I said that if one ever wanted one's signature forged, one could hardly choose a better man than Mr. Drake, considering his professional experience." "What professional experience?" Poirot asked, very softly. She hesitated, then continued with bitter frankness. "Lionel Drake was dismissed from Hartwell and Associates banking firm 5 years ago, under suspicion of having altered figures and authorized payments without proper consent. The matter was hushed up to avoid scandal, but it leaked in certain circles. I've known of it for some time." "How did you know?" Arkwright demanded. "Through friends. Society is a small place if one moves in it long enough." Dr. Cartwright shifted uneasily. "That seems rather unkind, Miss Vale." "Unkind, perhaps," she replied coldly. "But I didn't expect him to be murdered because of it." Poirot's fingers touched his mustache thoughtfully. "So, Monsieur Drake carried with him a past of which he was not proud, a past that could be awkward if revived." His gaze sharpened. "He knew that you knew." "Oh yes," she said bitterly. "I made certain of that last evening." The room fell into uncomfortable silence. Colonel Redmayne cleared his throat roughly. "Damned unpleasant business all around. But surely you're not suggesting that someone killed the poor devil over an old banking scandal?" "I suggest nothing yet, mon colonel. But secrets, they have a way of becoming dangerous when exposed to the wrong light." Poirot rose with delicate finality. "For now, the facts are these. A man with a questionable past is stabbed with a weapon taken from downstairs. No one admits to hearing anything. No one claims to have left their rooms. Yet someone did." He moved toward the door, then paused. "I ask you all to remain together. Talk, if you will, but be careful what you say. The murderer will be listening also." As he left, closing the door softly, the rich tapestry of tensions he had sensed the previous evening seemed to quiver into sharper relief. Already, in some small detail, Hercule Poirot had seen something that did not quite accord with the picture presented. The investigation had begun in earnest. Poirot returned to the study with the measured tread of a man whose mind was already working at full capacity. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and he stepped inside, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. Now, in the profound quiet of the death chamber, he could conduct his examination without the distracting presence of shocked witnesses and their inevitable protestations of innocence. The morning light, filtered through snow-laden windows, cast the scene in stark relief. Poirot approached the body with reverent precision, his keen eyes noting details that had escaped him during the earlier confusion. The silver letter opener, which he recognized as belonging to the writing desk in the main lounge, had been driven home with considerable force, angled slightly upward beneath the ribs with surgical precision. "Tiens," murmured Poirot, crouching beside the body without disturbing it. "This is not the work of a panicked amateur. The angle is too calculated, too exact." He examined the overturned chair. Noting its position suggested Drake had risen from his seat, perhaps in alarm or greeting, before stumbling backward as the blade found its mark. The scattered papers on the desk drew his particular attention, fragments of what appeared to be a letter, though the content was largely illegible due to Drake's agitated handwriting. One sheet, however, bore a single line in steadier script. "The matter we discussed cannot be allowed to proceed further." Most intriguing was the telltale footprint near the door, a clear impression in the thin layer of dust, made by a leather sole with distinctive circular indentations. Not Drake's slipper, certainly, nor the heavy boots favored by Colonel Redmayne. The depth suggested someone of moderate weight. The clarity indicated recent origin, and the position just inside the doorway told its own story of calculated entry. Poirot noted other significant details. The teacup on the windowsill, half empty and cold, but not yet filming over, suggesting recent use. The missing wallet that a nervous man like Drake would surely have kept close. And most peculiar of all, a tiny scrap of burnt paper near the waste paper basket. Too charred to reveal its contents, but clearly destroyed with purpose. A soft knock interrupted his contemplation. "Monsieur Poirot," came Dr. Cartwright's voice. "Might I have a word?" Poirot admitted the doctor, whose broad face bore professional concern mixed with something less easily defined. "I've been reconsidering the wound," Cartwright said without preamble. "The angle, the depth. Whoever did this possessed either medical knowledge or remarkable anatomical instinct. This wasn't luck or desperation, but precision." "And the time, Doctor?" Cartwright considered carefully. "Rigor mortis is well established. Body temperature significantly reduced. Death occurred between 2 and 4 o'clock this morning, I should estimate. During the hours when all claimed to be sleeping peacefully," Poirot observed quietly. When he rejoined the others in the lounge, the atmosphere had crystallized into something approaching consensus. Nigel Arkwright stood by the window, his face flushed with indignation, while the others regarded him with expressions ranging from suspicion to reluctant certainty. "It's perfectly obvious," Miss Vale was saying, her earlier distress replaced by brittle determination. "Nigel was furious with Lionel last night, and again this morning. He left the room early, had every opportunity, and the strongest motive among us," added Edward Latimer, looking up from his notebook. "At least in terms of immediate anger." Arkwright's voice cracked with protest. "This is madness. Yes, I was angry, but I didn't murder him. I went to my room briefly, then returned almost immediately. I never went near Drake's study." Dr. Cartwright shook his head gravely. "I'm afraid the evidence does seem to point in your direction, Arkwright. The timing fits, and you certainly had cause for anger." Colonel Redmayne's voice carried military finality. Unpleasant as it is, Monsieur Poirot, it appears we have our man. Poirot listened to this collective judgment with an expression of polite attention, his green eyes moving from face to face as the group grasped eagerly at the simplest, most obvious solution to their terror. He observed their relief at having identified a culprit, their willingness to accept convenient explanations. "Perhaps, mon colonel," Poirot said gently, touching his mustache with that characteristic gesture. Perhaps. But his tone suggested that for Hercule Poirot, the truth was rarely so accommodatingly straightforward. The first false lead had been laid, and like sheep following a familiar path, they had walked directly into it. The atmosphere in the lounge had crystallized into something approaching comfortable certainty. Nigel Arkwright sat isolated in a corner chair, his fair hair disheveled, and his hands clenched so tightly that the knuckles showed white against his pale skin. The others regarded him with expressions ranging from pity to barely concealed satisfaction at having identified their culprit so efficiently. "It's perfectly clear," Miss Vale was saying, her earlier distress replaced by brittle determination. "Nigel was furious with Lionel last night, and again this morning. He had every opportunity during those 20 minutes he was absent from the room." Dr. Cartwright nodded gravely. "The medical evidence supports it. Death occurred between 2 and 4 this morning, and young Arkwright certainly had the strongest immediate motive among us." Colonel Redmayne's voice carried military finality. "Unpleasant as it is, Monsieur Poirot, but the facts seem to speak for themselves." Poirot had been listening to this collective judgment with an expression of polite attention, his green eyes moving from face to face as the group grasped eagerly at the simplest, most obvious solution to their terror. Now he rose from his chair with that peculiar, bird-like alertness that marked his moments of greatest concentration. "Pardonnez-moi," he said with gentle courtesy, "but there is something that puzzles me greatly about this most convenient solution." The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward the small Belgian detective whose reputation for unraveling complex mysteries had preceded him to this isolated guest house. "Monsieur Arkwright," Poirot continued, his voice penetrating but kind, "you say you quarreled with Monsieur Drake this morning about Mademoiselle Vale's accusations. But tell me, what exactly did you hope to accomplish by confronting him?" Arkwright looked confused, hope creeping into his voice for the first time. "I wanted him to understand that Frankie meant no real harm. She has a sharp tongue, but she's not malicious." "Ah." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "So your concern was to protect Mademoiselle Vale's reputation, not to punish Monsieur Drake for his past indiscretions. But then, why would you subsequently murder the very man you wished to reconcile with? It is, how do you say, counterproductive, no?" A ripple of uncertainty passed through the assembled group. Mrs. Bligh, who had been silent in her corner, suddenly found her voice. "There's something else," she said, gaining strength. "I'm always up early for breakfast preparations. Around 5:30 this morning I heard footsteps in the corridor upstairs. Soft footsteps, like someone trying not to be heard." Poirot's eyes gleamed with sharp interest. "These footsteps, madame, they went in which direction?" "Toward the back of the house first, then returning. And then I heard a door closing very quietly downstairs. Not a bedroom door, those all squeak. This was different." "Most illuminating," Poirot murmured, beginning to pace slowly. "But consider also the weapon itself, the silver letter opener from the writing desk in this very lounge. For a crime of passion, one might expect a more immediate weapon, the poker from the fire perhaps, or a heavy object from one's own room. But to descend from the bedroom, enter this lounge, select a specific weapon, proceed to the study, commit murder, and return, this suggests not heated passion, but cold premeditation." The comfortable certainty that had settled upon the group began to waver like smoke in a draught. Miss Hargrove leaned forward with sharp attention. "You're suggesting the murder was planned?" "I suggest that we examine all possibilities before condemning a man," Poirot replied. And there is another matter that troubles me greatly. Monsieur Drake's past difficulties with the bank, they involved forgery, did they not? Such skills, they do not disappear. They remain like a loaded pistol in a drawer, waiting perhaps to be used again. Edward Latimer looked up from his notebook, understanding beginning to dawn. You think Drake was involved in some new deception? I think, Poirot said carefully, that a man with such a past carries many secrets. And secrets, mes amis, they have a way of becoming dangerous when the wrong person discovers them. More dangerous, perhaps, than a young man's momentary anger over a lady's sharp tongue. He paused, allowing his words to settle like sediment in still water. The facile solution was being dismantled, piece by careful piece, and in its place, the unsettling possibility of a deeper, colder motive began to emerge. So if Monsieur Arkwright is not our murderer, Miss Vale asked in a small voice, then who is? Poirot's smile was enigmatic. That, mademoiselle, is what we shall discover. But first, we must abandon our comfortable assumptions and look more carefully at what lies beneath the surface. The psychological game had begun in earnest. Poirot allowed the question to hang in, the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. He moved to the window, gazing out at the snow-locked landscape with that peculiar stillness that marked his moments of deepest concentration. When he turned back to face the assembled company, his green eyes held a new intensity. When one seeks the truth, he said quietly, one must first establish the facts with mathematical precision. We shall therefore reconstruct the events of last night, step by careful step. Each of you will tell me exactly how you spent the hours between midnight and dawn. Colonel Redmayne bristled at the suggestion. Are you proposing to interrogate us like common criminals? Not interrogation, mon colonel. Clarification. We are isolated with a murderer among us. It serves everyone's interest to establish what truly occurred. Poirot's tone remained courteous, but carried unmistakable authority. Dr. Cartwright, perhaps you would begin? The doctor nodded grimly. I retired shortly after 11, read for perhaps half an hour, then slept soundly until 6:30. I heard nothing unusual, saw no one in the corridors until I came down for breakfast. You heard no sounds during the night, no footsteps, no doors closing? Cartwright frowned thoughtfully. Now that you mention it, I do recall hearing a door close sometime in the early hours, but I attached no significance to it. Old houses are full of such sounds. Poirot made a small note. Mademoiselle Vale. Francesca started slightly, her earlier confidence now completely evaporated. I went upstairs around 11:30. I couldn't sleep. Too much excitement from the evening's unpleasantness. I read by candlelight, then dozed fitfully. I never left my room. Monsieur Arkwright. Nigel straightened defensively. I retired angry and stayed that way. Paced my room for a while, then tried to sleep. I woke several times, but remained in my room until morning. He paused, then added with emphasis, I never went near Drake's study. Ah, but that raises an interesting point, Poirot interjected. How did you know which room was his study? Mrs. Bligh spoke up unexpectedly. He wouldn't have known, sir. I only moved Mr. Drake to the study last evening because of a burst pipe in his usual room. He wasn't pleased about the arrangement, poor soul. This revelation sent a ripple of interest through the group. Poirot's eyebrows rose slightly. So the study was not Monsieur Drake's customary accommodation. Most illuminating. He turned to Miss Hargrove, who met his gaze with characteristic composure. I retired at 11, read until midnight, then slept deeply. I heard nothing and saw no one until Mrs. Bligh's terrible discovery. Monsieur Latimer? The broadcaster consulted his notebook. Went up around 11:30, made some notes for a possible program, turned out the light near midnight. Woke around 5 and couldn't return to sleep, so I wrote a bit more by candlelight. You heard no sounds of movement? A creak or two, but I paid no attention. These old houses settle constantly. Finally, Poirot's attention settled on Colonel Redmayne. The military man met his gaze squarely. Retired at 11 sharp, read for an hour, then slept. I woke before 6 when the storm began to abate. Old campaign habits make me a light sleeper. I distinctly heard someone moving about upstairs, soft footsteps, deliberate but careful. They passed my door, went toward the back of the house, then returned perhaps 5 minutes later. Could you identify the footfall? Redmayne considered carefully. Light tread, but purposeful. Not Mrs. Bligh's heavy step. Someone trying not to be heard. Poirot sank into his chair, steepling his fingers. Most interesting. We have 2 witnesses to someone moving about between 5 and 6 o'clock, yet each of you claims to have remained in your rooms. Someone, it appears, has forgotten a small nocturnal excursion. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken accusations and growing fear. But there is something else that troubles me greatly, Poirot continued. The weapon, that silver letter opener from this very room. To select such a specific instrument suggests premeditation, not passion. Someone descended from their room, entered this lounge, chose their weapon with care, proceeded to the study, and committed murder. Miss Vale's voice came as barely a whisper. You're saying it was planned? I'm saying, mademoiselle, that we are dealing with a mind both calculating and desperate, and such a mind, when cornered, becomes exceedingly dangerous. Poirot rose with sudden decision. I shall now examine the scene once more, and then speak with each of you privately. Someone in this room knows more than they have revealed. The psychological game had begun in earnest. The revelation of nocturnal movements had injected fresh unease into the assembled company, but Poirot required more than whispered confessions and nervous denials. He returned to the study with renewed purpose, the locked door serving as a thin barrier between the living and the dead, and between confusion and clarity. Kneeling beside Drake's body once more, Poirot's trained eye caught details that had escaped him during the earlier shock of discovery. The silver letter opener, with its ornate griffin's head now stained dark, spoke of precision rather than passion. Dr. Cartwright's assessment of a surgical wound resonated deeply. This was deliberate, calculated murder. His attention turned to the scattered papers on the desk. Gathering the fragments with meticulous care, he began piecing together what appeared to be drafts of a desperate letter. Drake's agitated handwriting revealed fragments of a larger story. The matter we discussed cannot be allowed to proceed further on one sheet, and more tellingly, my reputation, already fragile, cannot withstand another scandal. Your demands are extortionate. The web of extortion. Extortion. The word crystallized in Poirot's mind like frost on glass. This explained Drake's nervous energy, his sleepless nights, his desperate attempt to post a letter despite the approaching storm. Someone had been bleeding him slowly, and last night's public humiliation about his banking scandal had pushed him to a breaking point. Near the wastepaper basket, Poirot discovered a partially burnt fragment bearing 3 legible letters. R.O.W. Part of a name, perhaps, or a location, but significant enough that someone had tried to destroy it completely. Most intriguingly, the teacup on the windowsill bore a faint lipstick stain in a delicate rose-petal pink, a shade he distinctly remembered adorning Miss Vale's lips the previous evening. Yet she had claimed never to have left her room. Hidden evidence. Tucked almost imperceptibly beneath the edge of the Persian rug, near Drake's outflung hand, lay a tiny pearl button. Poirot recognized it immediately, identical to those adorning Miss Hargrove's carefully pressed cardigan. The composed, observant woman who claimed to have slept deeply and heard nothing had left behind this silent witness to her presence. He carefully preserved the button in a small envelope. This was his hidden clue, the crucial detail that everyone else had overlooked in their shock and haste to find a convenient culprit. Revealing conversations. A soft knock interrupted his contemplation. Mrs. Bligh appeared, wringing her hands with distress. Monsieur Poirot, I've been thinking about what you asked, about Mr. Drake's habits as a guest. Ah, madame, please continue. He always paid in cash, sir. Never a check, never a bank draft. Always counted out the exact amount in notes, as if he didn't trust banks anymore. She paused meaningfully. And he was always asking about the post, when it came, when it went, whether letters could be sent urgently to London. This revelation painted a picture of a man living entirely outside the banking system that had once employed him. A man conducting business that required absolute discretion. The psychological portrait. Returning to the lounge, Poirot found Edward Latimer making notes by the window. The broadcaster looked up guiltily. Force of habit, I'm afraid, though it seems ghoulish under the circumstances. Not at all, monsieur. You observe, you record. Not so different from my own methods. Tell me, did you notice anything particular about Monsieur Drake's behavior recently? Latimer consulted his notebook. Increasingly agitated, especially yesterday evening. I saw him slip an envelope into his jacket pocket with the air of a man hiding something urgent. Later, he inquired desperately about postal deliveries, even with the storm approaching. As if time were working against him? Exactly. He seemed driven by some invisible deadline. The emerging pattern. Poirot assembled the fragments in his mind. A man with a compromised past, paying only in cash, conducting secretive correspondence, being extorted by someone who signed their demands with initials including R.O.B.U. The public revelation of his banking scandal had apparently forced a crisis, either pay the escalating demands or face complete ruin. But someone had decided that Drake's silence was worth more than his money. The precision of the wound, the careful selection of the weapon, the early morning timing, all spoke of premeditation rather than panic. The pearl button pressed against his waistcoat pocket like a small, hard truth. Miss Hargrove, the quietly observant woman who noticed everything, had been present at the scene. But was she victim or perpetrator in this deadly game of secrets? Poirot's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a man who had found the loose thread in a tightly woven tapestry. The psychological game was reaching its crucial phase. The afternoon light had begun its winter retreat when Poirot announced his intention to conduct private interviews. He spent a contemplative hour in his room, arranging his few possessions with mathematical precision, each small ritual a moment of mental calibration. The pearl button rested in its envelope on his nightstand, a tiny witness waiting to speak its truth. When he descended to the lounge, the atmosphere had crystallized into something approaching dread. The initial shock had evolved into suspicion, and now palpable fear. The assembled guests regarded him with expressions ranging from apprehension to barely concealed terror. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice cutting gently through the oppressive quiet. "I shall require a few minutes with each of you privately. The small morning room will serve our purpose admirably. Truth, you understand, often hides itself when there is an audience. The first confession. Mademoiselle Vale," he said with quiet authority. "Perhaps you would be so kind as to join me first." Francesca entered the morning room with her chin held high, but her hands trembled as she arranged herself in the offered chair. The confident society woman had been replaced by someone far more fragile. "There are certain inconsistencies in your account that require clarification," Poirot said gently. "You claim to have remained in your room throughout the night, yet I discovered a teacup in the study bearing traces of lipstick in a most distinctive shade, the same rose-petal pink you wore yesterday evening." The color drained from her face. Her carefully maintained composure crumbled like a house of cards. "I couldn't sleep after that dreadful scene," she whispered. "Around 2 o'clock I went downstairs. I thought everyone was asleep. I felt guilty about my cruel remarks and wanted to apologize." "And you encountered Monsieur Drake?" "Yes. He was in the study, writing frantically by candlelight. He looked terrible, haggard, desperate. When he saw me, He became almost violent in his insistence that I leave immediately. She paused, gathering courage. But I convinced him to let me make tea first. We spoke briefly. What did he say? Only that he was trying to fix things before it was too late. He mentioned initials, ROWs, said they would mean everything to him and nothing to anyone else. He seemed genuinely terrified, Monsieur Poirot. Not angry as he'd been earlier, but frightened. Poirot made careful notes, and you left him alive and unharmed. Of course, I may have a sharp tongue, but I'm not a murderess. The critical evidence. Mademoiselle Hargrove, Poirot called next, his tone carrying particular significance. She entered with characteristic composure, but Poirot's keen eye detected subtle signs of strain beneath the disciplined exterior. "I assume you wish to discuss my nocturnal activities, Monsieur Poirot," she said with startling directness. The admission came with such calm calculation that even Poirot was momentarily taken aback. It was no frightened confession, but the measured revelation of someone who had decided that partial truth was safer than complete deception. "Indeed, mademoiselle, there is the matter of a small pearl button, identical to those adorning your cardigan, found beneath the edge of the rug near Monsieur Drake's outflung hand." Her pupils dilated slightly, the only crack in her composed facade. "You're certain?" "Absolutely. You were in that room with him, alive, some time before or after the murder." She gave a small, strangled laugh that broke into something nearer to a sob. "This is intolerable. But very well. I did go to Mr. Drake's room in the early hours. Not to kill him." "Then for what purpose?" Her hands unclasped, palms now flat, as though she had reached a decision. "To demand he stop bleeding me dry. Mr. Drake was not merely a man with a stained past, Monsieur Poirot. He was a blackmailer." The revelation hung in the air like smoke. Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Continue." "He discovered that my younger brother had committed a foolish act, forging a solicitor's signature to obtain an advance on an expected inheritance. The firm chose to hush it up if he resigned quietly, but Drake obtained sufficient detail to turn it to profit. He demanded money regularly. At first, small sums, then more, always in cash. Yesterday he hinted that the next demand would be his last and largest. I went to him around 3:30, found him at his desk with papers scattered everywhere. We argued in low voices. I begged. He remained obstinate, even triumphant. As I turned to go, my sleeve caught on the desk. I didn't notice the button torn loose. And he was alive when you left. Very much alive, and very angry. But alive, I swear it." The medical perspective. Dr. Cartwright appeared genuinely distressed when summoned, his broad face creased with professional concern. "The precision of the wound troubles me greatly," he admitted. "The angle, the depth. It struck precisely between the ribs, avoiding bone, penetrating directly to the heart. Death would have been almost instantaneous." "Could such accuracy be achieved by chance?" Cartwright shook his head slowly. "Highly unlikely. This required either anatomical knowledge or previous experience with edged weapons." "And you, Doctor, do you possess such experience?" "Military service during the war, field surgery under combat conditions. But I've spent my career healing, not harming." The military connection. Colonel Redmayne entered with military bearing intact, but Poirot detected subtle signs of strain beneath the disciplined exterior. "Colonel, your account of hearing footsteps was most precise, but I must ask you about your own past acquaintance with Monsieur Drake." The military man's composure flickered almost imperceptibly. "I beg your pardon. You recognized him, did you not? Not from this visit, but from before." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Redmayne's shoulders sagged slightly. "Yes, I knew him from the Hartwell banking affair. I was called as a character witness during the internal investigation. Damnable business. The evidence was circumstantial, but damning. Yet you said nothing when Mademoiselle Vale revealed his past. What was the point? The man was trying to rebuild his life." The gathering storm. As Poirot completed his interviews, the pattern became clear. Drake had not merely been a victim of his past. He had weaponized others' secrets for profit. The blackmail, the desperate letter-writing, the cash-only existence, all painted a picture of a man living entirely outside legitimate society, but someone had decided that Drake's silence was worth more than his money. The precision of the wound, the careful selection of the weapon, the early morning timing, all spoke of premeditation rather than panic. When Poirot returned to the lounge, he found the assembled guests watching him with expressions of barely controlled fear. The psychological pressure had reached its crescendo. "The crime," he announced, his voice resonating with quiet authority, "was not one of passion. It was a calculated act, designed to silence a man who knew too much, a man who was threatening to expose someone's carefully constructed deception." The stage was set for the final, devastating reveal. The grandfather clock chimed 6 times as Poirot positioned himself before the assembled company with the deliberate precision of a conductor preparing for the final movement of a complex symphony. The winter afternoon had surrendered to early darkness, and the lounge was lit by the warm glow of oil lamps and the flickering fire. Outside, the storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world transformed by pristine snow, a deceptive purity that mirrored the carefully constructed facades within. The stage is set. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice carrying that peculiar authority that comes from absolute certainty, "we have reached the moment when all must be revealed. You have been patient with the questions of Hercule Poirot, and now you shall have your answers. The murder of Lionel Drake was not a crime of passion, as we first supposed, but a carefully calculated act designed to silence a man who had become dangerously inconvenient." He paused, his green eyes moving deliberately from face to face, noting the subtle variations in expression, the tightening of lips, the involuntary shifting of posture, the careful avoidance of direct eye contact, dismantling the obvious. "Let us first dispose of what is convenient but false. You wished at one moment to believe that Monsieur Arkwright, in a fit of anger, committed this crime. The evidence seemed to support this. His public quarrel with the deceased, his temporary absence from the lounge, his obvious distress. But the facts, they do not align with such a theory." Poirot moved to the writing desk, his hands gesturing with characteristic precision. The weapon was chosen from this very room and carried to the study with deliberate intent. Such calculation does not accord with an impulsive, emotional outburst over an indiscreet remark. Moreover, Monsieur Arkwright did not even know which room served as Monsieur Drake's temporary study, a detail that Mrs. Bly has confirmed. The physical evidence speaks. Now, let us examine what the evidence truly tells us. In the study, I discovered several crucial items that paint a very different picture than the one we initially accepted. From his waistcoat pocket, Poirot produced a small envelope. First, this tiny pearl button, found beneath the edge of the rug near Monsieur Drake's outflung hand. It matches precisely those adorning Miss Hargrove's cardigan. She has courageously admitted to visiting Drake in the early hours, confirming that she left him alive, but agitated. He moved to the mantelpiece, his reflection dancing in the mirror above. Second, the teacup bearing traces of rose-petal pink lipstick, Mademoiselle Vale's shade. She too has admitted to her nocturnal visit, finding Drake in a state of terror, writing frantically. She also left him alive. The medical precision. But most significant of all is the nature of the wound itself. Dr. Cartwright, you described it with admirable precision. A surgical strike, angled perfectly between the ribs to reach the heart with minimal external bleeding. You noted that such accuracy required either anatomical knowledge or remarkable instinct. Poirot's gaze settled on the doctor, whose broad face had grown increasingly pale. You possess such knowledge, do you not, doctor? Your military service during the war, your experience with field surgery under combat conditions, these would provide exactly the expertise required for such a precise, lethal blow. The footprint evidence. There is also the matter of the distinctive footprint found in the dust near the study door. A leather sole with circular indentations. Not Drake's slippers, not the Colonel's heavy boots, but something altogether different. I observed your walking boots drying by the kitchen door this morning, Doctor. The pattern matches exactly. Dr. Cartwright's hands gripped the arms of his chair, knuckles white with tension. The true motive revealed. But why, you ask, would a respected physician commit such a calculated murder? The answer lies in those mysterious initials that so troubled Monsieur Drake, R.O.W. You see, these were not the beginning of a name, but an abbreviation that would be familiar to anyone in the medical profession. Right of way, a legal term, yes, but also the name of a small clinic where you once practiced, Doctor. Poirot began to pace slowly, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of inexorable logic. Monsieur Drake, with his banking background and unfortunate experience with financial irregularities, had been investigating various investment opportunities. In doing so, he discovered certain irregularities in the insurance claims and patient records from your time at the right-of-way clinic. Claims for treatments never provided, prescriptions for medications never dispensed, billing for procedures that existed only on paper. The web of blackmail. Drake confronted you with this evidence, did he not? He demanded payment for his silence, not just once, but regularly. The fragments of his desperate letter revealed a man under tremendous pressure, someone being bled dry by escalating demands. But these were not payments to Drake. They were payments from him to you, Doctor. He was your victim, not your blackmailer. The room fell into absolute silence. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly. But last night's public humiliation, when Mademoiselle Vale revealed his past difficulties with forgery, pushed Drake to desperation. He decided to expose everything rather than continue paying. That letter he was writing so frantically, it was to the medical board, detailing your fraudulent practices. The method revealed. You could not allow that letter to be sent. So you rose in the early hours, selected the letter opener from this lounge, choosing it deliberately because it would not be missed from your own belongings, and proceeded to the study. Drake, perhaps expecting another payment demand, admitted you readily. You struck once, precisely, using your medical knowledge to ensure death was instantaneous and relatively bloodless. Poirot stopped directly before Dr. Cartwright, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. You then attempted to stage the scene to suggest a struggle, overturning the chair, scattering papers, but you could not resist the physician's impulse to check your work, hence the footprint, the evidence of your presence after the deed was done. The final confrontation, Dr. Cartwright's professional composure finally cracked. His broad shoulders sagged, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of defeat. He would have destroyed everything I had worked to build, my practice, my reputation, the trust of my patients, all ruined by a petty blackmailer who saw only figures on a ledger. But you became something far worse than he ever was, Miss Hargrove said quietly, her voice carrying unexpected steel. He threatened reputations. You took a life. Poirot nodded gravely. That is the tragedy, Doctor. In seeking to preserve your good name, you have lost not only your reputation, but your soul. The arithmetic of murder never balances. It only compounds the original sin. Justice and reflection. As the sound of approaching vehicles reached them through the clearing night, Dr. Cartwright rose with dignity and tact despite his circumstances. I will not run from what I have done, he said quietly. Perhaps there is some honor left in facing the consequences. When the formalities had been completed and Dr. Cartwright taken into custody, Poirot stood once more in the doorway of the lounge, surveying the scene of his latest triumph over chaos and deception. The snow, he murmured to himself. It covers many tracks, but not the tracks that matter most. Those are always here. He tapped his temple gently. In the little grey cells, where truth cannot be buried by any storm. The affair at the Midnight Guesthouse had reached its conclusion, but the study of human nature, that most intricate and dangerous puzzle of all, continued as endlessly fascinating as ever. The morning following Dr. Cartwright's confession dawned with crystalline clarity, the storm-swept sky now a pale blue canvas against which the snow-covered moors stretched in pristine silence. The world looked innocent again, as though murder had never walked its frozen surface. Yet inside the Midnight Guesthouse, the atmosphere remained heavy with the weight of revelation and the profound transformation that truth brings to human understanding. The reckoning of justice. The sound of engines, faint at first but growing steadily stronger, announced the arrival of the outside world. Within the hour, a local constable stood in the lounge, his face flushed from the cold trek through the snow, listening with growing amazement as Poirot methodically recounted the details of the crime. Dr. Cartwright, his broad shoulders slumped under the weight of his exposed deceptions, offered no resistance. The man who had been so meticulous in his crime, so precise in his medical observations, now faced the stark reality of his actions with weary resignation. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Dr. Cartwright turned briefly toward Poirot, and in that fleeting moment there passed between them something akin to professional recognition. The acknowledgement of one methodical mind by another, though one had been devoted to healing and the other to truth. "I will not run from what I have done," Cartwright said quietly, his voice carrying the dignity of a man who had finally stopped deceiving himself. "Perhaps there is some honor left in facing the consequences." The aftermath of truth. Breakfast was a subdued affair, the dining room feeling too spacious now, the empty chairs too conspicuous. Mrs. Bligh moved about with forced briskness, her eyes still reddened from weeping, while the remaining guests sat in contemplative silence, each processing the night's revelations in their own way. Miss Hargrove was the first to break the uncomfortable quiet, her composed features betraying the strain of recent events. "I owe you an explanation, Monsieur Poirot," she said with characteristic directness. "My brother's transgression was real, but I had already decided to expose the matter myself rather than continue living under the shadow of potential scandal. When I confronted Drake last night, it was to inform him that his blackmail had lost its power over me." She paused, her steady gaze meeting Poirot's understanding eyes. "He became quite frantic, you see. Without my payments, he couldn't meet his own obligations to Dr. Cartwright. In a way, my decision to stop paying him sealed his fate." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "You cannot carry responsibility for the choices of others, mademoiselle. Each person must answer for their own actions. Dr. Cartwright chose murder when he could have chosen confession." The weight of words. Francesca Vale, her earlier vivacity replaced by subdued thoughtfulness, toyed with her toast, unable to meet anyone's eyes directly. "I keep thinking that if I hadn't made those cruel remarks about forgery, none of this would have happened," she said quietly. "You believe your words caused Monsieur Drake's death?" Poirot asked gently. "They certainly contributed to it. My public humiliation of him forced his hand, made him desperate enough to threaten Dr. Cartwright with exposure." Poirot considered this carefully. "Tell me, mademoiselle, why did you make such remarks? Was it merely social cruelty, or something deeper?" She flushed slightly, then met his gaze with newfound honesty. "I suppose I suspected he might be involved in something current. His nervous behavior, his cash payments, his secretive correspondence. It all suggested ongoing deception. I was trying to force him into the open, though I never imagined it would lead to this." "Your instincts detected something amiss," Poirot observed. "That is not cruelty, that is observation. The tragedy is that your intuition was correct, but the web of deception was far more complex than anyone could have imagined." The philosophy of human nature. Nigel Arkwright, who had spent the night grappling with how quickly he might have been condemned for a crime he didn't commit, looked up from his untouched breakfast. "You were right about me, Monsieur Poirot. I was almost grateful when everyone decided I must have done it. It saved me having to think further." "The obvious solution has great charm," Poirot replied kindly. "It allows the mind to rest. Only the truth, alas, is rarely so accommodating." He spread his hands expressively. "You see, I have a profound distrust of solutions that fit too comfortably. They're like second-hand shoes. They may appear to be the right size, but they pinch in places one does not at first feel." Colonel Redmayne, his military bearing intact despite the strain of recent events, spoke with heavy conviction. "Cartwright was a good man once. I served with his like during the war. Hard to reconcile that with what he became." "War leaves in some men not scars upon the body, but distortions of the soul," Poirot replied thoughtfully. "They return with a certain elasticity of conscience where necessity is concerned. The first small dishonesty is justified, the second more easily. Soon the line has vanished altogether. It is seldom one great leap that makes a criminal, but many tiny, comfortable steps." The departures. As the morning progressed and the roads became fully passable, the guests began their preparations to leave. Each departure carried with it the weight of transformation. They were not the same people who had arrived at the Midnight Guesthouse just days before. Miss Hargrove approached Poirot as she prepared to leave. "You have my gratitude," she said simply, "not only for uncovering the truth, but for distinguishing between weakness and wickedness." "There is often a thread between them, mademoiselle," Poirot replied. "But it is important to see how it is woven." Edward Latimer, his notebook finally closed, hesitated at the door. "If I were to tell this story, what would you wish the public to take from it?" Poirot considered carefully. "That justice is not merely a matter of handcuffs and courtrooms, monsieur, but of seeing clearly. That evil often wears the face of respectability, and perhaps that the truth, like the snow, covers everything equally, but eventually melts to reveal what lies beneath." The final wisdom. As the last motorcar pulled away, sending up arcs of slush and snow, Poirot remained standing in the doorway beside Mrs. Bligh. The guest house, which had seemed a cozy retreat mere days ago, now bore the invisible weight of darker history. "Will you continue operating the guest house?" Poirot asked gently. Mrs. Bligh nodded with determined resolution. "Life must go on, mustn't it? But I think I'll be more careful about my guests in future." Poirot smiled. Perhaps that is wise, though in truth the most dangerous people are often those who appear most respectable. When his own motor car arrived, Poirot settled into the passenger seat with characteristic precision, his small suitcase arranged perfectly in the boot. As they pulled away from the Midnight Guesthouse, he reflected on the curious alchemy that transforms ordinary people into killers. "The little grey cells," he murmured to himself. "Watching the pristine landscape roll past, they are both humanity's greatest gift and its most dangerous curse. They can heal or harm, create or destroy, depending entirely upon the moral compass of their owner." The affair at the Midnight Guesthouse had ended, but the eternal struggle between good and evil, truth and deception, continued as it always had and always would. Dr. Cartwright had been a healer, sworn to preserve life, yet fear of exposure had driven him to the most calculated of murders. He had valued his reputation above the sanctity of human life, and in doing so had irrevocably forfeited both. As the snow began to fall again, gently this time, Poirot knew that beneath that pristine surface, the tracks of truth would remain forever, waiting for the next observer skilled enough to read their meaning. Murder, he reflected, was always vulgar, but its causes were sometimes tragically human. And somewhere, inevitably, Hercule Poirot would be called upon once again to untangle the complex web of human motivation and restore order to chaos. The case was closed, but the study of human nature, that most intricate and dangerous puzzle of all, continued as endlessly fascinating as ever.